It's worth remembering the history here, Yvonne. Viewers might recall that when Sitiveni Rabuka took power, there was a distinct cooling of the relationship between Fiji and China. That was for a couple of reasons. The first one was that Mr. Rabuka made it clear that at least when it came to policing and security cooperation, he had a strong preference for dealing with what he called Fiji's traditional partners, namely Australia in particular and New Zealand. And he promised that he would tear up a policing agreement between China and Fiji. On top of that, he also really angered Beijing by allowing the Taiwanese embassy in Suva to adopt an old name that it used to use, which gave, in the eyes of the Chinese, much more legitimacy to that mission, rather than the Chinese Taipei Trade Office, which was the much more limited title it had under his predecessor, Mr. Bainimarama. So all of that meant that there was a real undercurrent of resentment and frustration in Beijing towards Fiji. We saw some fairly pointed articles in Chinese state media accusing Mr. Rabuka of poor behavior. China's ambassador to the Pacific warned that the patience of the Chinese only stretched so far. Over the last 6 months, though, things have been warming up slightly. Mr. Rabuka has backtracked on that move to tear up the policing agreement, although he has said that he won't embed Chinese police officers in Fiji. He's backtracked on that move with the Taiwanese office, which is now once again the Taipei Trade Office in Suva, and he's struck a more conciliatory tone with China, whilst maintaining this line that he wants to maintain security arrangements with Australia, the US and New Zealand, saying that he really admires what China has done, for example, when it comes to economic development. Now, it is also worth remembering a rather extraordinary episode last year when Mr. Rabuka was last meant to go to China. This is when those tensions were running high. And then he posted a picture and a video of himself to social media with a bloodied head and a Band-Aid on top of his head, saying he could not go to China because he'd run into a door. Now, this was a pretty unlikely episode, but again, on Chinese social media, it just stirred more bad blood. So the fact that there's now a more conciliatory approach being taken, at least rhetorically, by Mr. Rabuka, the fact that he is now finally making this long-awaited trip to China, and the fact that you seem to see a leveling out in that relationship shows that in some ways the bilateral relationship is now on a more even keel.
And when he is there, what are the key priorities for Fiji's Prime Minister in China, and how closely will Australia be watching?
Look, whenever a Pacific leader travels to China, and there have been quite a few of them going over recently, Australia always pays fairly close attention. That doesn't mean they're always, or that Australian officials are always deeply anxious about the visit, but it's always something they'll watch. Look, Mr. Rabuka has made it clear that his main priority is going to be very much economic development. In particular, what lessons can Fiji draw from China's own path towards development, in particular when it comes to the agricultural sphere and, diversification, development, the development of more value-added industries within the agriculture sector. That's his main preoccupation. That's what he says. Now, unsurprisingly, he's going to go to a number of Chinese provinces. We don't yet have a schedule, but he's made it clear he'll spend 10 days in China. And it sounds like the first 7 to 8 days are going to be in various provinces, most likely in the south, because they're the provinces which typically have close links into both Fiji and the Pacific. But he wants to try and maintain a pretty laser-like focus on some of those economic imperatives. And in particular, I think we're going to hear a lot about the way that Chinese aid and development might be able to help Fiji to develop some of those industries. The question, or one of the questions that Australian officials and others will be grappling with will be, one, will Mr. Rabuka do anything in the policing and security space? And two, might he look to get any sort of loans from China? Now, on the loans front, Mr. Rabuka has said no. He doesn't want to go to anyone other than traditional partners for loans, and he's warned against Fiji getting, as he puts it, embroiled in too much debt. So I don't think we'll see anything on that space. In the policing space, it's perhaps a little bit more unclear. Mr. Rabuka has struck a very firm line on this, as I mentioned, making it very clear he doesn't want to engage with China as a major security partner. But it is interesting that he is, at least according to some Western sources who are watching this trip, going to visit a Chinese police academy in the south of China, in the city of Fuzhou. where a number of Pacific leaders have been wheeled through recently as part of China's efforts to display its abilities and its acumen as a police training provider. So it'll be interesting to see if he does in fact go there, and then what he has to say there. The feeling here in Canberra is that he's probably going to look and nod politely and do nothing more. But I think it will be something that will be, to use a cliche, monitored pretty closely, not just in Canberra, but also in Wellington and in Washington too.
And Stephen, this comes ahead of Pacific leaders visiting New Caledonia next week, and then a critical meeting in Tonga at the end of the month, a really busy period in Pacific politics.
Yeah, frenetic. The trip to New Caledonia, which will include, incidentally, Mr. Rabuka, as well as Mark Brown, the Cook Islands Prime Minister, and Jeremiah Manele, the Solomon Islands Prime Minister, is going to be a really critical and interesting one. Exactly who they will meet and what they will do is not 100% clear. On the face of it, it's a, quote, fact-finding mission to report back to the PIF leaders meeting, which will happen in Tonga at the very end of the month. But Mr. Rabuka, when speaking about the mission today, sketched out a slightly more expansive agenda, saying that he also wanted to talk with various parties about how the Pacific could play the role of a bridge between pro-independence and pro-loyalist forces within New Caledonia. Now, that prospect is a very sensitive one, particularly for the French government, which wants to make it very clear it sees this as entirely an internal matter. But it's going to be a fascinating trip, and the Pacific Islands Forum will have to decide when it does meet exactly how it wants to approach it. How much pressure does it want to ramp up on France? If any at all, over its approach to New Caledonia? Will it demand collectively that France goes through with another referendum in the wake of that very contentious 2021 vote, which was vastly in favour of staying with France, but which was boycotted by the vast majority of pro-independence supporters? So these are all difficult questions for the Pacific, and also difficult questions for Australia, which has maintained a studied neutrality and distance on the whole question of New Caledonian independence, in sharp contrast to many other Pacific nations. Now, of course, the other thing that's very much worth watching at the Pacific Islands Forum is exactly what we see in terms of the cooperation between all the parties, whether Australia can push through its Pacific policing initiative, its ambitious plan to reshape policing in the Pacific, what that group does say on New Caledonia, what's said on West Papua. It's going to be a really interesting and consequential meeting. And of course, Antonio Guterres, the UN Secretary General, will also be there, which will ensure, as ever, that there's a sharp focus on climate, the Pacific's role on climate change negotiations, and Australia's push to host a COP UN meeting in 2026 in partnership with Pacific nations. An opportunity that Pacific civil society says is one that the region cannot miss to really ramp up pressure on Australia to show greater ambition on climate. So it's a really fascinating and consequential few weeks in Pacific politics and regional geopolitics, and one that's going to be very, very interesting as it develops.
We'll be watching closely. Stephen Dziedzic, thank you.
Thanks, Yvonne. Appreciate it.